All right, so I am starting from scratch here. And I don't know why it has started doing this. It's the most recent update of VS Code. I don't like what they did with the terminal. All right, so I have this totally empty project. So I know that I want to create a Django project, which means that I'm going to have to install Django. And I also know that I don't want to install Django globally, so I will create a virtual environment. So Python -mven, whatever you want to call it. And then activate it. So source. Okay, so now I'm in my virtual environment and I will install Django. Pip install Django. Okay, does anyone know how I can get started on a Django project?
Is it a pip install?
Okay, so I just installed Django, so now I have Django available to me.
Oh,
So now you you need to create a project.
Yeah, right. So Django, the basic structure, Django has a project. So whatever you're working on, you will create one project, and that project will have potentially lots of apps in it. So we'll create the project first. So Django admin create project, and the name of it, I'll just call it my project. Yes, start project, my bad. Okay, and when I do that here, I have a manage.py, which we'll use to run commands. And then this my project, which is kind of like your project level settings. Okay, and then I'm going to cd into my project. Oops. And then I'm going to create an app. So I have, have my project. Now I'm going to create an application. So I will do that with, there's a couple ways to do it. You can actually do it with manage.py, but I'll do Django admin start app, my app. So now I have this application, which is going to be some, kind of encapsulated set of functionality that can work inside my project. All right, so I have this. Now I'm going to go ahead and go into my models. I'm going to create a very simple model. So we talked about the basic structure. We'll see the full stack Django application next week. But for now, we're just focusing on the models. So we can create a class, and this is just be a student. So this will be, the student will represent a table. So there'll be a student table in our database. And I will inherit from models.model. This is Django's basic model. They give us a whole bunch of functionality. And then what we need to do here for adding columns is we just create these attributes. So we can do name and email. And then name is going to be, we're going to use, so if this were Django, we would say, like varchar 32 or something like that, right? So we would have to give it a data type and then sometimes some kind of like restriction. here we're going to use, we'll do the same thing, but we'll use built-in Django stuff. So models dot, and it will be, we can do whatever we want. We'll do a character field. And there are some options you can pass in. You need to pass in a max length. And you can know that by looking at the documentation. So let's say 15 characters for the name, and then an email, models, and there just happens to be an email field. So there's a whole bunch of fields, just like there are a whole bunch of data types. I don't think we need to pass anything in there. All right. So I'm going to say that that's good enough for our purposes right now. One other thing we can do that you're probably almost always going to want to do is override the default string method. So you get a more sensible representation when you're doing things in the admin panel, which we haven't talked about yet, and also on the command line. So def str. And I will just we'll return both of these. Okay. All right, so we have our mod, we've created our project, then we created our app. And so we'll find that, I guess you'll find that once you start making Django apps, there's a whole bunch of things you need to get do, and it's not entirely clear what order you should do them in. You can develop your own flow, but one thing we need to do after we create an app and a project is tell the project about our app. So it's not going to automatically know that we have this app here floating around. So we have to go into our settings, which is at the project level. We go to the settings here, and we can add it to the installed apps. There are a few different ways you can just add it to the end of the list, but when you start making more complicated apps, you'll have lots of built-in stuff, lots of third-party stuff, lots of your own stuff, and it can be a little bit messy. So one thing you can do is you can just kind of basically append it. But you could have one of these, you can basically block them off, and depending on if it's third-party or something you made or whatever. So we'll add this here, my app. All right, and then once we have that basically taken care of, we're gonna have to create our database. So we have our model, which means, at least at this point, we know what we want our database to look like. So in order to do that with Django, it's a two-step process. So we've written our models, which is the Django-y way of expressing what we want a table or tables to look like. So we have to run make migrations first. So Django Python manage.py make migrations. And you can also specify an app name here. If you don't specify anything, it'll do it for everything. If you only want to basically update one app, a particular app, you can specify it there. But we'll do everything for now, which is the same as just specifying one. And we have this migrations folder in the app. And we can see that we got this initial migration file. This is kind of an intermediate. It's a little bit more detailed than what we wrote in the model. You don't have to worry about that. And then once we have the migrations file, we actually need to migrate. So Python manage.py migrate. And the first time you migrate, you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff because there is a whole bunch of stuff by default. All these installed apps, they have their own database requirements. So you could just delete all this and not have anything standard, but you probably wouldn't want to do that. So now we have our all of our databases for this project set up, including the one that we specifically wanted set up. So we could go Python manage.py shell. So now we're in this Python shell. So last time we showed you this shell plus command. If you can install the Django Extensions, this third-party helper utility. But here I'll just do this the default Django way. So we run Python manage.py shell, and now we're in the shell, and we're going to go ahead and load the models. So we'll give it the app name, my app.models, import student, and then we'll run a query just on student. So student.objects. Objects is what's called a manager, and you can customize the manager if you need to, but this is basically how you're gonna run queries and stuff. So student.objects.all. This is like select star from student. We run this and we get an empty query set. So we can tell that our student, the student table is set up because we're not getting an error or anything. Now there's nothing in it, and that's fine, but we have this empty query set. Are there any questions so far?
Was that manage py file, that manage py file was created when you started the project automatically, right?
Correct. Yeah. So when you first start the project, you get all of the project stuff, all the project settings, all this right here, the server information, and then we'll talk about URLs later. And then this manage.py also got created. So when you're running commands, you have to make sure that you're, in your root project level so that you can access that file. Okay. So I'm going to exit from the interpreter, and so we have a totally fresh database. We could if we wanted to populate it with some basic dummy data, we could go in here and then run student.objects.create or whatever. There's a couple of different ways you can create new rows in your database, and then we could just create a bunch by hand. We could also potentially write like a SQL script file, and then just so let me back up one quick second and say that I'm using the default SQLite database right now, and by default, when you just create an application, that's what Django is going to do. Now we're going to want to use Postgres, but I'm just being kind of lazy. So I'm using the SQLite database, but that's very easy to change. You just change this to PostgreSQL, and then you change this to just the name of the database that you've created, and then everything will work fine. So one thing we could do, whether you're using SQLite or Postgres, is run some kind of script that will populate the database, and that way you could have some kind of initial thing, and that would work fine. But it's just it's a little complicated. You kind of have two things you need to manage. You can also do that within Django. So Django has a kind of a built-in way for you to do something like that, and there are kind of two ways of doing that, or two use cases. One is if you want to populate the actual database that you want to use with some initial data, whether it's dummy data or some actual data, you can do that. The other use case is for running tests. So when you run tests, you're probably you're not going to want to use the actual database. Like if this were a production application in production, you wouldn't want to be running tests on the actual database. And even if you had like a local copy or a development copy, that would be potentially much more than you need, right? So anytime you're running tests, you want to watch out for side effects, and side effects would include something like a call to a database, right? So if you're running a test and you need to access some database on a server, that's just another level of complexity that you want to avoid in unit tests in particular. So Django will handle that by creating a dummy database. And so there are a bunch of default settings which you can change around, but you probably won't need to. But when you run a test, you can actually determine how Django does that. So right now, let's create some of this dummy data, and Django calls this a fixture. So a fixture is basically going to be a file. It can be JSON or YAML. We'll use JSON just because doesn't require any other dependencies. So a JSON file, it's going to represent rows, basically rows in whatever tables you want. And you have that file, it doesn't change, it's hard coded, and then you basically will load that file and populate the database from the file. So this a fixture is an app level phenomenon. So for each individual app, you could have your own fixtures, but we'll create a folder called fixtures, and then we can create a file called okay, so we have this JSON file called student fixtures, and I'm just going to copy paste this so I don't have to write a bunch of JSON. The format will be the same. So this is a JSON object. We have an array. Then we have a bunch of objects to represent each row. So there are some default keys. We have the model, and then the primary key, and we have this fields, which is going to be however, whatever field. So name, address, email, blah, blah, blah. You have foreign keys, right? And we're just gonna, so I think my app, let me change this. Okay, so we have a bunch of dummy users now. So if we want to write so we could actually load this into our actual database. So you could try doing that. So let's do that. Let's say we want this to be permanent. We want to start our application with these for students for whatever reason. So we can do Python manage.py and then load data, and then we just give it the name of the file, student fixtures, and it knows to look in the fixtures. It's by default it will look for this in fixtures. We can do that, and we get some feedback installed for objects. Now we can go into the interpreter here. So Python manage.py shell, and I'm going to import from my app.models import student, and then I'm gonna basically do select star from student. So student.objects.all, and I have all of that information loaded into the database right now. Any questions so far?
I just want to follow what you just did. You loaded the data first, and then in the shell
Yeah, so I went
from
into,
my app line is.
yeah, so when I go into the shell, I basically have access to my Django application, but I have to import. So this is one reason why you would want to use a utility like Django Extensions, because one of the convenient things it does is when you go into the interpreter, it will automatically load, it imports everything that you have in your project, so you don't have to do all these import statements.
And I'm sorry, and where did you get this dummy data from? I was taking notes when you had retrieved this information. Where did you get this JSON information from?
Where did I mean, I just made up the names and emails. Do you mean
Oh, okay.
like how it's structured?
Yeah, where did you copy and paste this from somewhere, or you said you just made it up? Okay.
Yeah, I copied and pasted from an example that I had earlier, but this basic format where you have model, primary key, and then fields, this is going to be kind of a standard format. And then this particular student model had a name field and an email field, but you could have lots of other fields as well. So I will also mention, you may or may not have occasion to do that. Let's say you have a database already, and then you can actually reverse this process. So you can create a JSON file like this from a database. So if you have a database and you kind of want to use that as a fixture, you can do the reverse process, create a JSON file from the database, and then use that anytime you start your application or whatever.
And if you're doing it that direction, can it be any, like, could it be just like a CSV or?
So I know that Django, you can have your fixture format be YAML or JSON. I think YAML is a more readable format for something like this rather than JSON, but you need to add another dependency in order to do that. We haven't really talked about YAML also, so I don't want to do that. It's just a format. I'm not sure that you could use a CSV. It might be possible, but you probably wouldn't want to use a CSV. Okay, so I'll exit here, and I'm going to delete the database. It's that. Here we go. I'll just go ahead and delete this as well. Or make migrations and then Python. So I'm just deleting the database to start over. That's a quick and easy way to do that. Obviously, you wouldn't want to do that, in a production application. Okay, so let's say, so one thing you do is you can have fixtures and then you can load your actual, let's say your production database. But maybe that's a more limited use case. Probably what you're going to want to do is load these fixtures as dummy data for testing purposes. So you can do that also pretty easily. So I have the fixtures already right there. And then test case. So Django's testing framework is an extension or subclassing the unit test, the basic unit test case library, which we're familiar with already. So it looks very similar. So we'll do class test students, and we'll inherit from test case. This is Django's Django's basic test. There are a couple other classes you could use if you have more specialized purposes, but so once we have this class, then we write a bunch of methods, and method names start with test, just like Python's unit test. We can also run a, well, let's do this. So fixtures. So we can tell it that, hey, here's basically the data that we want to have in the database, and that will be, what's that? Student fixtures. So Django is prepared to understand this. You just include this attribute fixtures, and Django will know what to do with that. And then if you write a test, so test, I'll just write a dummy test, all users. Let's do. Okay, so first, just so we know, I'm going to go back into the shell and make sure that our production database is empty. So Python manage.py shell, and I'm going to import from my app.models, import student, the student model, and then I'll student.objects.all. So it worked. There's nothing there. So let's exit. Now we're going to run this test, and we should see the contents of the database there. So Python manage.py test. Name student is not defined. That's because I didn't import it. So from models, import student. And the test passes, and we can see this query set, which I've printed out, contains everything from this fixture. And if I go back into the shell again, this is why using a utility like Django Extensions is useful. So models dot student. I get an empty query set. So this test, it created a dummy database, populated it with the data that we specified in the fixtures file right here, and then deleted the database once the test stopped running. So if you want to test your models and things in the database, this is basically how you're going to do it. Having said that, there's a variation here where instead of hard coding all of the stuff, maybe this is tedious, maybe your models are changing frequently. So then if you have a large complicated JSON file, you're having to go through and modify this all the time. So you can do something that's a little more automated. There are a few third-party packages that do this. I'm going to use something called Model Bakery. So Model Bakery is a third-party module we can install. I'm going to install it, and we'll look at the README. You don't have to use something like this. Okay, so now I have that installed, and I can look at the README. So here is from the models.py, this example customer, right? So if you have a large model with lots of complicated stuff on it, it gets, creating a JSON from it can tedious. So we can go into test here, and then what's happening here, so this setup, which is run before everything, before any of the tests, it's going to create a customer, so this like an instance of this customer class, and we're going to run baker.make. So all we have to do is it's automatically going to populate the fields that we need, so we don't have to worry about creating that ourselves. So it's going to give you dummy data, obviously, like this nonsense, but it will give you data that fits the requirements of the data type that you specify. So we can do something like that. Def set up data. There's another command. What's that, Django? Set up test data. Set up test data. This is actually a class method. You could look up the details of this in the documentation, or Okay, so set up test data. This is basically the setup you want to run for all of this. So I'm just going to create an instance of the model that we can use for multiple tests. So student equals, so I'm going to have to import back to the documentation. So from model bakery, import baker. So baker.make, and then we'll pass it basically the import. So that will be from app.whatever. So my app.student. Yeah, and we can just print this to make sure that it works. So this will give us all of the attributes here. So let's run this test. Okay, so notice I commented out the fixtures line, so that doesn't show up anymore, right? So it still creates this test database, and then this setup test data runs, and it has this ID of 1, and the name is gibberish name. The email is also gibberish, but at example.com, so it will fit the requirements of an email. And then when we test all users, that works fine. You can also do both. So if you want to have fixtures and then also create, some ad hoc dummy data, you can do that as well. So if we run the tests, they will both show up. So the first 5 of these are from the file, and then this last one is random dummy data. Are there any questions about that?
I have a question. Is that making an instance of our student app, like baker.make, my app.student? Is that making a name and email for our student model, or is it like other data?
It's just so Baker, this module will just look at the model, and it will create appropriate dummy data. So whatever fields you have, it will, I mean, I don't know exactly what it does under the hood, but it will create appropriate dummy data. So it knows that this is an email field, for example. So that's why we get this @example.com. And this is a name. Notice that we said that the max length is 15 characters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. This is 15 characters. So there are other kind of dummy data creation libraries that you could use as well. This is just one.
So it creates dummy data, so do we have to remove the dummy data to replace it with our own data?
You have to remove it, like,
You
so
said it prints out that dummy data, so what if we want to replace it with our own data? I mean, so we would just replace it with our own data? I'm just trying to understand this, because it
So-
prints out that dummy data there.
yeah, so this is only for tests. So
Just for tests, okay,
when you run a test, it will
Okay.
create a test database. And
okay,
then once the tests are stopped running, it will delete the test database.
okay.
So it won't affect your actual production database.
So what tells it how many to bake?
So we just are doing one here.
Oh, so if you wanted to do like 10, you'd do that, put that in a for loop or something?
Yeah,
Okay.
there might be a way to specify that. I mean, there's another one that I was playing around with a few days ago where you could tell it how many to create just on the command line. So there are lots of, well, there are a few packages that do similar things. Okay. So yeah, that was just kind of general background so that you understand, well, one, how to test models, and two, how some of the exercises are working. That's where all these phantom databases are coming from. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about validators or validations, and it's mostly going to be showing you the documentation. So again, a lot of this will be adventures in documentation. So validation can and should happen at multiple layers in your application. You can do stuff on the front end. So trying to enter an email field. If you have an HTML document and you tell it that it's an email field, it will by default impose certain basic validation. So if you don't include an @, it will not let you submit a form. So that's like the front layer at the HTML layer. There's a middle layer. So in your views, basically, or your model, depending on what you're doing, you can validate data. So you get input from a user. You can run validation or checks, making sure that, let's say, an email field has particular features or whatever. A phone number is formatted in a particular way, whatever the requirements of your application are. And then at the database level, as we know from just writing SQL queries and insert statements, at the database level, there's also some validations enforced. So for example, if you have varchar 20 and you try to insert a new field that has 30 characters, you're going to get an error. So those are basically the three layers at which validation can occur. And of course, you never ever want to accept unprocessed input from a user. So that's the basic idea. So how do you actually do this in Django? We're going to be focusing on the models right now. So we'll look at the validation at or at the user interface later. For now, the model. So in Django, a lot of what we do in Django is going to be overriding or modifying or customizing things that already exist. So Django is a huge application, and there are lots of things that happen. So for example, when you create, if I go in here, and if I want to create a new student, I can go student.objects.create, and I can do name equals okay. So I've created, so now my database has this new student, but under the hood, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening, and you can kind of hook into some of this process that happens and add customization along the way. One of those things, so we'll look at some of the documentation. There's a method called save that gets called. So here is one way of creating something. We use this create. And create is kind of a shortcut. It's a wrapper around basically creating an instance and then saving that instance. So you can do this again another way. So s equals student dot s equals student, and let's do so if I try to query the database now, let's do I only have Bob in there, but if I do s.save, and now I try to query, Jane is now in the database. So these are the two. So this student objects.create is kind of like a shortcut function that creates the instance. Sorry. It creates the instance and then saves it. So you can actually tap into this save method and do things if you'd like. So you can override it. So again, if you subclass from something, you can kind of shadow that method. So if you implement something called save, when Python is looking up the save method, it will find it first in your subclass. And then typically what you'll do with most Django things is you will override it, do whatever customization you want, and then call super. So you'll call the super classes save to handle the basic Django stuff, which is happening here. This is, by the way, an older style of using super. Okay. So just a quick tour of
real quick, where do you put that code in the example app? Where would you put that save method?
Yeah, you would put that in your models.
Oh, okay.
So in the class. So it would be a method in the student class. Okay, so we're looking at a validator. So there's validations on form validation, which we're not going to worry about right now, and then validating objects, which is how they're going to run in the database. So we scroll up here, validating objects. Again, this is partly an exercise in reading through the documentation. So there are some methods that will get called, and not everything works quite the way you would expect. So the challenge today will involve trying to read carefully through the documentation and looking things up and trying to figure out, trying to piece things together. But as a a head start, there are different methods that will get called, and sometimes you can call them explicitly. Sometimes they're called implicitly when you do basic things like save. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. So there's a clean method that you can override. There's a clean fields, clean, validate unique, and full clean. Here is information about save. So you can take a look at an example of overriding save. And that should be enough to get you started, basically. So we want to add the point of what we're doing in this challenge today is we want to add a level of validation that goes beyond just like this field can't have more than 20 characters. So you can do that at the database level, but you can't do things like this field, this email field can't end in .net, right? So you can't enforce that at the level of like a database, but you can in a validator. So that is basically it for today. Are there any questions? So one thing, just a caveat here, the Django documentation, there are lots of versions of Django documentation. For this, it shouldn't really matter if this is most recent 3.2. If you're using like 2-point-something documentation, it should also be fine, but just something to pay attention if you're clicking around and reading things. Just make sure you're on the right version.